Hello, brothers and sisters. I'm so glad to be able to talk to you today, even if it's through a Zoom tape. And I hope the day comes soon when your conventions and all of our normal activities can begin to reoccur in person. I think that the issue that I wanted to bring to the table today is really important for the future of our nation. It really has to do with why is it important for unions? Why is it important for ordinary Americans to work together for racial justice? Why is it critical that we solve this American problem, particularly of a history of racism? And it really is important to all of us, not because we want to be nice people, though we do want to be nice people. It's because this problem of racial ideology is holding back our whole nation. Look for a moment at the shootings that occurred this spring in Atlanta, where a young white man went into a number of spas and shot Asian-looking women. When this first happened, many people in the country were hesitant to say that this was a hate crime, hesitant to say that this shooting, this act of violence, was really based on our American notion and ideology of white supremacy. But that's really a misleading notion, because it's important that we have a good understanding of what we mean when we talk about racism. And what we mean here is not simply bad thoughts that one person may have against another, prejudice. That's not good, it's not healthy. And much of the prejudice that we express in the United States comes from this feeling and ideology of white supremacy. But that's not really my definition of racism. To me, racism is an ideology that's intertwined with capitalism. That's why it's so important for workers and unions to understand this problem and to have vigorous anti-racist campaigns. Let me be clear. What I'm saying is the ideology that supports capitalism, that says it's okay for a small group of people to take wealth from the most workers, from the majority of the population, to keep for themselves, the notion that that's okay goes hand in hand with the notion that some people are more important than others, that some people are inherently better than others. And that's what we call racial capitalism. Now, these ideas existed even before America was settled. In fact, in the very earliest days of capitalism, before the Western world began to conquer and colonialize the other parts of the world, Irish people, Jewish people, Slavs, Roma, or what is often derogatory to refer to as gypsies, these European people were often discriminated against. And they were treated as though they were separate races, separate human beings. They weren't the same as the elites of Europe. And then when you begin to have colonialism spreading around the world, then this becomes what we know today as racism against people of color. So then there's a definition of racism that I like to use that comes to us from Dr. Kamara Jones. She argues that racism is a hierarchical system. That's critically important. It's not just a system that says, I don't like you because you're short, or I don't like you because your eyes are blue. It's a system that categorizes and unfairly disadvantages some people. It insists that Mexicans are below whites, Blacks are below Mexicans. It's a hierarchical system based on a ladder. And at the same time that it unfairly disadvantages some people, it unfairly advantages other people. And this is the part that I think many of us as individuals have trouble with. So we may go through our lives and think, well, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not a racist. But again, that's really not what racism is about. It's not just what you personally feel. It's how the society structures things around you. And that's why the most important part of understanding racism is understanding what structural racism is, because structural racism saps the strength of the whole society. I'm a physician. I practiced medicine for 40 years. And because I am a physician in the United States of America, I have some privileges. I don't have all the privileges that a Bill Gates has, but nonetheless, I am treated and have certain resources that a typical Black woman of my age might not have. That privilege, that reality that I'm treated differently and I have different resources because I'm a physician, happens whether I want it to happen or not. And similarly, when we talk about racism and the hierarchy, the privilege that people have based on where they are on that ladder happens whether they want it to happen or not. It happens automatically in the background. Anti-Black racism, that is to say racism against people of African descent, plays a special role in this sort of hierarchical scheme, because in all the schemes throughout all of the history of modern capitalism, Blacks, Africans are placed at the bottom of that hierarchy, at the bottom of the ladder. Other people on the ladder move up and down depending on the time and place. So sometimes in Texas, for example, Mexicans and Mexican Americans were considered white. Other times in Texas, Mexican and Mexican Americans were considered Mexican and not as good as white people. So who is white or where you are on the ladder changes through time and place. So what do we do about all of this confusion? And how do we begin to recognize racist activities and policies when we see them? I think the first place to start, the easiest place to start, an important place that everyone can take an action about is what we call institutional racism. That's the expression of these racist ideas, these hierarchical ideas in the organizations and institutions that we're part of every day. It might be the city council, it might be your church, it might be the PTA, it might be your union. And so again, we have to ask ourselves, are there policies and procedures? Are there things that we do that we think are normal that in fact are an expression of white supremacy, that are a historical legacy from racism? And today, especially our younger generation, are working actively on these things. So structural racism then is just normalizing, regularizing racism. And it becomes so normal and regular that it's hard for people to see. Structural racism begins right with the beginning of our nation. It begins with the stealing of the land from Native Americans. And in order to do this and justify this, Native Americans and our indigenous people all over the hemisphere, but let's look at the United States, are considered subhuman. In fact, it's not until 1924 that the Supreme Court decides that Indians are human and may have the right to vote in this, their own land. So we should be careful how we think about these issues, and we need to understand history. And at the same time that Black Americans were being lynched throughout the South, at the same time, in the Southwest of our country, having conquered the northern part of Mexico, in the Southwest, Americans were lynching Mexican Americans and Mexicans in large part to steal their land. And they were lynching them in the same numbers. But this is not a normal part of our history. And during this same period, when Chinese immigrants were coming over and building the transcontinental railroads, the largest single lynching, recorded lynching in American history, occurred in Los Angeles when over 20 Chinese men and boys were lynched because they were Chinese. So our country has a long history of racism. It has a long history of building our norms and our cultures and our laws around this. And it doesn't matter whether they're efforts to restrict voting today, or whether there were efforts after the Civil War to just ban all voting for Blacks. They're still there and they're still operative. And if we as union leaders and activists don't understand that and fight and stand up against it, we're in trouble. Brothers and sisters, this is not a time for us to be timid. It's a time for us to say what we believe and to act on what we believe. And we should not be intimidated by the problems that can overwhelm us. I agree with the Poor People's Campaign, and I think they have a perfect emergency agenda to help us get out of this trouble. It means that we have to challenge the value systems of the elite, and we have to put forward our own value systems, values that every working man and woman agree with, values that we think are important for the survival of our families, our neighbors, our community. That means, for example, we have to have an appropriate answer to the present crisis we're under with COVID-19. We should make changes that should have been made a long time ago. And we need to make sure that the American people understand the pandemic and have the tools that they need to get vaccinated, to set up rules and regulations to protect each other and their families from this disease. And understand that the reason we have this pandemic is because of the climate change problems, which brings animals in closer contacts with human beings. We will continue to see pandemics like this as we go forward. We should have passed Medicare for all 100 years ago, but it needs to happen today. We need to understand that universal medical care, making sure that every man, woman, and child has health care, is critical to moving forward. We need to make sure that people are paid a decent wage. I actually don't think $15 an hour is appropriate. I think that's too little. I think we should have a minimum wage that allows a person who's going to work and working full-time not to live in poverty. They should live with security and have a secure income and retirement. I don't think $15 an hour will do it, but at least it's a start. And we have to address poverty. We have to say we can eliminate poverty. We can. This is the richest country in the world. There's no reason for anyone in this country to be living in poverty. And yet we have almost a quarter of our children living in poverty, 20% of our population food insecure. We need to obviously have housing for everyone. We need to make sure that this present bills in Congress around infrastructure, both the physical infrastructure and the so-called human infrastructure pass. That's a small down payment on what we need, but we need to make sure that happens. And we can't make sure that happens unless we secure and protect voting rights. Understand what the Electoral College was invented for. It was invented to keep white supremacy on top, and we need to address whether that needs to be abolished. I support the abolition of the Electoral College. Why can't we just elect our president with the popular vote? We have to make sure that education is a basic right, not only for children, but for human beings throughout their lifetime. It ought to be free, it ought to be high quality, and it should exist throughout your whole life. We need to have comprehensive immigration reform, not a little thing here and there, comprehensive immigration reform. The reason people come here is because we have gone there and messed up stuff. So we need to come to grips with this and set about policies that allow the world free movement of people around the world. We need to make sure that we ensure the rights of our indigenous people. We've broken every single treaty that the United States government has made with them. We need to address that now. There was an effort to kill them off, but let me be clear, like they say, they're still here and we should respect that. We need to have fair taxes. That's part of our problem. We can start that tomorrow. You tax people that have money. You tax corporations. We should not have our major corporations running around tax-free, paying less taxes than you and I pay. We need to, the young people talk about taking money from the police. I'm an older generation. We need to take money from the Pentagon and ask ourselves how much money is being wasted in the Pentagon building bombs and planes. That what are we going to do with them? So these are some basic emergency measures that we need to fight for, but we really need to come together and say, if we can promise ourselves that we will create an economic system that puts human beings at the center and gives them the most respect, does not allow workers to be harmed, killed, injured, maimed, and disrespected, and build with that an anti-racist movement that insists that all human beings have equal worth. All human beings have equal worth, and we can afford to build structures around all of us to make sure that that becomes a reality. If we can do those two things, if this union can help in that fight, then we will have lived up to the promise of our ancestors as we stand on their shoulders and we form a firm platform for our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to continue trying to guarantee that we leave a world at peace where justice is the norm. Thank you.